Hello, welcome to our Experts Forum dialogue on the topic of COVID-19 and sustainability. Today, we are so glad to have our very special guest, Professor Michael EDESESS. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Michelle.
Thank you so much for being our interviewee. Michael has a very strong background on mathematics. He is currently adjunct associate professor in both Hong Kong UST's Division of Environment and Sustainability and in the Department of Finance. Michael received his first degree from MIT, majoring in philosophy and mathematics, and then went on to receive his PhD in pure math. Not only math and modeling, Michael also has extensive experience in the financial industry and sustainability. So, Michael, welcome again. I know that your background is very special and very interesting to a lot of young people, especially working on sustainability. Would you mind sharing with us what you are doing to describe your transition from an economist to working on sustainability?
Well, first of all, I wasn't an economist at all until after I got my PhD in mathematics. In fact, I didn't know what economics was, to be perfectly honest. At MIT, I could have taken a course with the most prominent person at the time in economics, Paul Samuelson, but I thought I'd never use it. So I thought, oh no, why should I do that? But after getting a PhD in mathematics, I just kind of accidentally wound up going to work for a financial firm. I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't. It had to do with stocks and maybe stocks and bonds, but I didn't know what they were. So, but it didn't take very long to learn. And I won't go into the whole thing, but it was this company that I worked for was supposed to be at the center of the new sophisticated mathematics of finance. But I found that it just wasn't that at all, not at all. It's not, and it still is. The field of finance is not mathematically sophisticated. So I did that for a few years, so as not to quit, but I really didn't like it. And I had always been interested in the environment. I like to be out of doors. I like to hike. During undergraduate school at MIT, I used to go to the White Mountains in New Hampshire every weekend, and then for school vacations, and I'd go snowshoeing in miserable conditions. I slept out at 40 below zero and was in 80-mile-an-hour winds. And I'm an environmentalist in that way, in the way of loving the out of doors and loving nature. When I started to realize that I just didn't want to be in this financial field, I spent a little time thinking, so what do I really want to do? And I decided two things. I decided the best thing to do would be to work in solar energy and to live in Colorado. I wanted to do that. And by some kind of miracle, at that moment, I discovered that there was a new research institution starting in Colorado called the Solar Energy Research Institute. It's now called NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So I went and worked there for a few years. Having been in the financial industry, I decided while I was doing that, I really ought to find out what economics is. So I learned about economics, and people at conferences, I remember a guy said, well, you're an economist, you know this or that. I said, well, I'm not an economist. He said, so what are you? I said, well, I'm a mathematician. He said, well, same thing. Well, they're not the same thing, but I thought, I better find out what economics is about. So I was self-taught in that, really. Although later I became chief economist of another financial firm, but that was much later. Anyway, so I have a background in research on renewable energy and finance. In order to make a decent living, I had to do work in the financial industry. And I thought, well, what I can do is join boards of nonprofit organizations. So I joined most prominently now, although at the time it was rather small organization, Rocky Mountain Institute. And I really enjoyed that, I have to tell you. But it was much smaller and much more informal at the time that I was on the board. And I chaired the board about 22 years ago. Now it's much bigger, and has many, many more employees. And I also was on a couple of other boards that you would say were in the area of environment and sustainability. So that's what I did.
Michael, I also know that you recently has contributed to 2 book chapters in this new book published early this year. The book is called How COVID-19 Took Over the World, Lessons for the Future. Could you tell us a little bit about this book and what are the 2 chapters you wrote about?
So I wrote one chapter called The Mathematics of COVID-19, and then I co-authored with Christine Lowe a chapter called The Social and Economic Consequences of COVID-19. I think that was the title of the chapter. The one on mathematics is about the mathematical modeling. So very early, there's a whole field of epidemiology, which is not solely, but largely mathematical modeling of the spread of disease. And so as soon as there was news that there was a new viral disease, COVID-19, the modelers kicked into action and they started trying to model, well, how bad is this going to get? How many infections will there be? How many hospitalizations will there be? How many deaths will there be? And this is all done by mathematical modeling, computer modeling. The chapter is about and how it's done, what the results were in some of the early modeling, which wound up scaring people, and some countries that initially China clamped down as soon as, almost as soon as they realized this is going to be bad. The United States and the UK and some other countries didn't do that. Fire was kind of lit under them, mainly by the results of a mathematical model that was run by Imperial College in London. So it played a major role in changing the approach that US and UK and some other countries took to the virus.
I see, I see. So as you said, isn't it? Now I start to understand more about the role of mathematics because it really helps a lot on making predictions, projections. So as the predictions will be very useful for decision makers and policy makers to plan ahead.
Yeah.
So that to reduce the risk and so on, isn't it? And is it mathematics also plays a big role on sustainability?
Yeah, well, just like in the COVID models, the objective of the modeling is to say, well, what if is to determine public policy, with public policy to try to reduce those numbers. So usually there's a comparison. So the most prominent mathematical model involved with the field of sustainability now is undoubtedly they're called integrated assessment models, but that's just a very opaque name for models that project impact on future climate of various levels of emissions of greenhouse gases and their impacts on the global economy. So that's the purpose of these I'll call them IAMS models because that's what they're called, integrated assessment models. But the idea is to say, let's take a base case called business as usual, which really means we don't do anything to try to mitigate these effects. Let's just assume that greenhouse gas emissions increase at the same rate they've been increasing in the past. Given that input to the model, let's project what's going to happen to the climate as a result to the global economy. Suppose we do something. We institute some public policy measures to try to reduce those emissions. That's never modeled. The whole idea is to say, okay, what can we do to reduce these emissions because they're going to cause some problems. So you rerun the model saying, okay, suppose that we were able to reduce those emissions by a certain amount each year in the future. Now, what's the end result, the effect on the economy? Does it improve things, and by how much? So this is why this particular mathematical tool is very much used in the field of studying the effects of climate change and and what would happen if we change public policy to try to mitigate these effects.
The inconvenient truth is that similar kinds of pandemics might be happening more and more in future. This is so sad, but we ought to learn quickly from the experience how to plan ahead of time. So mathematics really play an important role on that.
Well, this is something I say in the chapter on mathematics, that instead of just suddenly running models, of course there are models run anyway, because it's a field and people write papers, of course, because they have to write papers. If they're in universities, they have to write papers whether there's a pandemic or not. But the number of papers increased enormously with COVID, and the attention given to these models. But even when there's no pandemic, it would be a good idea to say, especially given the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, to say, okay, let's really run these models to figure out, now we have some time to relax, we hope, and we can plan better for the next pandemic, partly by running these mathematical models to see, well, what should we do when the next one comes? I think there probably ought to be some stepped up activity with these models, just to get ready for the next one.
Yeah, in fact, the reason why we are doing this interview series is that Hong Kong UST Institute for the Environment has recently done an extensive survey to also trying to understand the impact of COVID-19 on people's behavioral and value change. So among the 5 study domains, we noted in the domain of institution that additional vulnerabilities was there, particularly within the healthcare system and the labor market. So Michael, you also mentioned in this book, there is another chapter called the economic and social consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you have also highlighted some issues of the exacerbated inequalities. What is your overall observation on this particular issue?
On the issue of the consequences of the social and economic,
the social consequences and the inequalities.
Well, it seems very likely that this pandemic increased inequality, and there are many reasons for it. My easiest reference points are in the United States, because I'm more familiar with it, and also it did the most per capita to try to keep people from losing income during the pandemic. So there was just massive spending to send people directly some money so that they would be able to survive during the duration of the pandemic. But not to the extent of China, but in the United States, it was also the policy to try to get people to stay home. And one thing that's still very contentious is that students were generally required to stay home. Schools closed. There were subsidies for computers for students to be able to work at home, but the poorer students had less good access to the internet, and so they were less able to really continue a good education. Their parents had to scrape, they couldn't go to their jobs. Well, fortunately, the government was giving them some subsidies, but still they were under more difficult conditions to get along through the pandemic. The service workers, the people who were, digital workers, people who could work on their computer at home. Obviously, it was easier for them to continue than if somebody worked in a slaughterhouse cutting up meats. An awful lot of things cause this to happen, that the poorer people get poorer and the richer people get richer. And unfortunately, the pandemic probably contributed to that on a national scale, but also to some degree on an international scale. Because for one thing, and I think that this pandemic may have contributed to divisions between the developed North, let's call it, and what's now being called the global South, because when vaccines were developed, they went more to the developed countries, and they weren't shared very well with the less developed countries. This was not fair, but this is what happened, and it does tend to happen because the most needed things are by the wealthiest countries and the wealthiest people. So it contributed to inequality within nations and probably in the world. But this is hard to ascertain, so I'm just speculating.
I see. Yeah. So this is always the issue. We have climate inequality, but this time, isn't it? Can we describe it as the pandemic inequality? When we talk about sustainability, it's always talking about the balance between environment, economy, and society. And it's also the interrelationship or mutual influence among the three circle. So looking at the whole sustainability perspective or looking forward in the pursuit of a better sustainable future, Michael, if I know it's hard to say, but if I finally would like to invite you to summarize in one thing, what would you think that matters the most for, pushing, shaping a sustainable future?
Research and development. We need better technology, and we're not sure which of the technologies. Something that it kind of disturbs me a little when I see this. There are people who will say, when it comes to sustainability, if we're talking about one of the major issues, of course, these days is the issue of climate change. And there are people who will say, "Oh, we have the solution. We know what the solution is. We can do, we can implement it right away. But we're lacking the political will." This is just not true. We're going to need a continuing stream of technological innovations, and not just innovations, but development, testing prototypes. It's going to need an awful lot of new technological development, science and technology. And that means we need to fund research much better. In the United States, the funding for research is half as a percentage of GDP what it was a few decades ago. That's not good. It should be much higher. And that's what we need more than anything else. Bill Gates's book called, I don't know, How to Prevent a Climate Disaster or something, I think he takes the right approach to this. He says each of these technologies that we need, more, let's say, optimistic people, he's not pessimistic, but let's say overly optimistic people will say, we have all this. We know what we have to do. It's all there. It's all available. What he does is he takes these technologies and he says, well, here's what the gap is between what we can do and what we need to do. And in each case, we need to bring the cost down. We need to bring the cost of batteries down. And almost every one of these things that we need to close a gap. And the only way to do that is with continued research and development and trying different things, which means you need a lot of investment to do this. And so I'd say that's the most important thing.
So being the University of Science and Technology, we do have a lot of real things, pragmatic things to work on, to work hard on, right? So
yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Every time talking to you, I learn a lot.
Well, I couldn't ask for better. So thank you.
Thank you so much. See you later.
Okay, thanks, Michelle.